Go ahead and get this. All right, good morning again, and thank you so much for joining us for our Pathway to Publication series, How to Read Author Guidelines that will be presented by Sara Hauber today. My name is Danielle McCamey. I'm the founder, CEO, and president of DMPs of Color, and I'm excited to have you all join us today. As you all know, DMPs of Color, our mission is to serve DMPs of color through networking, mentorship, and advocacy to increase diversity in nursing practice. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Sara Hauber has been a professional editor for 25 years and a DMP editor for the past 10 years. From 2011 to 2018, she was a student's editorial advisor and writing instructor for the Duke University School of Nursing. During that time, she recognized that the majority of DMP students had the exact same problems when attempting to write a journal manuscript about their DMP project. So in 2018, she began pilot testing a comprehensive manuscript writing program that became a 6-step to publication-ready journal manuscript, affectionately called My DMP Manuscript. This year, she is starting her own PhD journey, and she is excited to share her passion for manuscript writing with the docs community. Her ultimate goal is to help you all get published and share your important work with the larger healthcare community. And without further ado, I introduce you to Sara Hauber. So Sara, please take over. Mike's all yours.
Thanks, Danielle. I really appreciate that. I'm so happy to be here with the group today. As Danielle said, it really is my goal to help everyone get published. I feel like we need to have more voices in scientific, medical, healthcare publication. So that's what I'm hoping this session can help you all start to do today. So as Danielle mentioned, this is a session about how to read author guidelines. Now, it might seem like, well, of course I know how to read author guidelines, but they can potentially be a little more complicated than you think. So we're going to get into that. I'm just going to scroll through my slides here. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but I want to let everyone know that if you have questions that come up during the course of the presentation, please go ahead and write them in the chat, and we will be very informal. I like to be pretty interactive with my sessions, so these non-in-person but online webinars are a little bit tricky for me, so I'd like to have the interaction. So anytime you have questions, go ahead and write them in the chat and we'll get to them. Oops. And if I know how to scroll forward on Google Docs presentation, that would probably be helpful. There we go. So again, this is part of the Pathway to Publication series and part 2, I believe. Same thing that Danielle had mentioned, editing manuscripts for publication since 2009, and then teaching manuscript writing specifically to DNPs since 2011. So hard to believe it's been 10 years already. The objectives of today, pretty simple. We're going to go over briefly what are author guidelines, why you need to read them, how to make the most of them, and then what to look out for, because there are some little specific things that can make the difference between whether your manuscript will be looked at for publication or immediately sent back to you because you didn't follow the guidelines. So what are author guidelines? Very simply, these will tell you what the journal does and does not accept from authors. So what types of articles are accepted by the journal? Specifics such as word count. As you know, word count, or you may know, word count can vary significantly between different types of journals. You'll want to know, does the journal require specific types of section headers throughout your manuscript? And really, really important would be the reference style, and in fact, the style of the whole manuscript, whether American Psychological Association, APA, or the American Medical Association, AMA. Those are the two big style guides that journals typically use. So the author guidelines will typically tell you that information. It will also often have information about copyright. So does the copyright transfer to the journal? Does the copyright stay with the author? Typically it's the latter. What are their submission rules? What is the lead time when you submit an article and when you get information back about acceptance, or whether you need to revise, or all of those timelines. Some journals will have that information in the author guidelines as well. So I wanted to ask a question really quickly, since we've got several people on the call now, and you can write your responses in the chat. I'm wondering how many of you have submitted an article for publication to a journal thus far. So if you go ahead and write in the chat, either yes or no, I'm curious. We've got a couple so far. Anyone else published? All right, so 2 out of 14. Oh, 3, yep, okay. So the minority of individuals on the call so far. Second author, Angela, well, that definitely still counts. You were still an author. Good. All right, so those of you that haven't, so we've got just under half. Excellent. Oh, I'm excited. This is good. So those of you that haven't submitted thus far, the information here might be more helpful for you, but those of you that have, we may touch on some things that could make it potentially easier or simplify the process in the future. So I'll continue. I do definitely want to point out that as far as author guidelines go, every journal will be different. And we're going to look at a couple of examples today, one of which Dr. Ferrara is intimate with, and see just how different the author guidelines can be from journal to journal. Some are very basic, some are extremely detailed, and those it's definitely harder to contribute your work to. Not impossible, just more difficult. So why would you read author guidelines? Really simple. You want to do your best to help the journal editors avoid inappropriate submissions. Now, why would you want to do that? Journal editors are extremely busy people. And this holds true for editors in every kind of publishing. I can tell you that, having been in publishing for more than 25 years, every journal editor is pressed for time. So you want to make it, you want to basically make a good first impression by only submitting articles that are appropriate for the journal. So don't get on the nerves of the editor right from the beginning. You also don't want to waste your own time. So when you carefully read author guidelines and make sure that you're submitting to an appropriate journal, you're not wasting time preparing a submission for a journal that won't accept your work. Then you'll have to go back and start fresh, and all of that takes time. So in theory, the author guidelines are there to make everyone's life easier, both the editors and the authors. So let's get into it. How do you read author guidelines? First, you need to find the author guidelines. Now, that might seem easy, but oftentimes they appear in places that you might not expect when you visit a journal's website. So you'll always want to go directly to the website for your specific journal of interest. And most of the time, you'll find the information under a section called Information for Authors or Author Resources. Now, this is typically separate from the Submission tab. So again, when we look at these examples, you'll see there's a Submit an Article or a Submission tab on a website. The Information for Authors or the Author Resources usually is separate from that submission page. Not always, but usually. So again, step one is first find those author guidelines on your journal's website. So the first example we're going to look at here is the Journal of Doctoral Nursing Practice. Quite appropriate for the audience here. And I am going to open this up now, since I'm already on Firefox. Hopefully this will show you my tabs. Oh, and I've already got it open anyway. So I'm going to close that. I've already got it open here. You should be able to see the website for JDNP. If you don't, just let me know. And I'm just going to scroll down here, and I want you in the chat again to let me know. And Stephen, you're not allowed to let people know because Dr. Ferrara is the editor of this journal, so he doesn't get to participate in this poll. Where would you look to find the author guidelines? So I'm going to, and this is not a test, you can't get it wrong. We're just going to see what your intuition tells you. I'm going to open up the chat again. Thanks, Stephen. So what do you think? Which tab would you look for the author guidelines here? This is just an example of how each journal is different. Anyone want to take a stab? Dr. Tayeb says submit an article. Let's check it out. Let's see what we get there. Submit an article. So manuscript submission. Look at that. Author resources, author guidelines. Bingo, we got it. So I want to look at the author guidelines later, I believe. So I just wanted to make sure you could find them first, and then we're going to take a peek at them later. All right, excellent. Right, submit an article, writing a manuscript. Where do you find more detail? The author guidelines link. So in this specific case, like we just saw on the website, when you click that, it will open a PDF, and we'll do that in just a minute together and take a look at those together. Now we've got another example. This is the Journal of Healthcare Quality. So again, I have that link already open. I'm just going to click it and then go through here. So what about this website? Where would we look for the author guidelines under this one? What do you think? Dr. Tayeb gets a star for getting that one right. Anyone want to guess here? Yes, we have 4 authors. What happens if I click that down? Submit a manuscript, information for authors. Okay, where next? Where would I go next? Keep going, keep telling me. This one's a little different. Anyone want to venture a guess? Information for authors. Let's see what we got. Information for authors. We've got instructions and guidelines right in the middle. So we're going to click on that and see if that's it. Bingo, it is. Perfect. Okay. So like I said, we're going to go back and look at those in just a minute together. But yes, in this case, oops, I went forward instead of back. So in this case, it was exactly right. So 4 authors and then information for authors. And that's a pretty standard. I think that was Lippincott. I always forget the rest of the company name, but LWW. I think that was their journal. And they are typically, it's either that or Taylor and Francis. All their journal websites typically look the same. So now my next tip is go to those author guidelines and read everything twice. Because like I said, some of them are more complicated, and it can take some back and forth between reading the guidelines and looking at your actual manuscript to make sure that you get everything right. So now I'd already looked at those, and I somehow missed a slide. So let me go back. No, I guess not. Sorry about that. We'll go back to our journal websites. And let's start with the Journal of Doctoral Nursing Practice. So let's open up those guidelines. Okay, now you can see here, it explains, and this is very standard for most journals that you're going to be looking at. The first paragraphs will give an overview of how often is that journal produced. So is it here, it's biannual, sometimes they're quarterly, you may have a bi-monthly, so every couple of months. Rarely you will have a monthly, but it is also possible. So it will tell you how often is that journal produced. And that will also give you an idea of how many manuscripts these journals are going to be seeing and accepting every year. So it is a peer-reviewed publication as well, and that's something that most of you will be looking for. You do want to have the peer review experience. As last month's Pathway to Publication workshop was so helpful in explaining about the peer review process, and you want to get those peer reviewers involved, and how can you improve, what information might you need to add. But to start off on the right foot, just reading these author guidelines before you submit, that will get you started in the publication process before the peer reviewer even sees your paper. So you'll see here they're focused on clinical excellence of the application of evidence-based practice of doctoral nursing. Now that perfectly explains what most of you were required to do as part of your DNP project for your DNP program. So this is an excellent journal to be submitting to. We have the mission of the JDNP is to support the advancement of the comprehensive and integrated roles doctorally prepared advanced practice nurses have within the healthcare system. Again, so this seems like a really good option, right, for submitting your manuscript. If we look here for manuscript preparation and review, they're going to spell out, okay, it should be a Word document. Again, this is standard, right? You're typically used to working in Word. Times New Roman 12 point. That also sounds familiar. Now look, we've got publication manual of the APA, so 7th edition. We want to do the APA manual. Oops, excuse me. Yes, and Dr. Tayeb says how often a journal is published is super important. Exactly. Definitely want to know that. That can also affect the timelines as far as lead time between when you submit and when it will actually be published. This also has information about submitting digital files. So if you are producing tables and figures, you'll need to follow the specifics for the journal. So this is pretty straightforward. You know, digital files for any figure should be TIFF files at 300 PPI or EPS. And that's something that if you are not used to working with figures or images of sizes, hiring someone to do that is a really good idea. Okay, so what else do we have here? Yes, this was the slide that I forwarded to and then went back to here because I think I missed a slide. A brief, less than 200 words structured abstract is required. So now, let me go back and show here. I just want to show this because there are two different kinds of abstracts. And every journal should tell you in their author guidelines whether they use a structured abstract or an unstructured abstract. And the difference between those two is a structured abstract will use headers. And those headers are typically something like background, methods, results, and findings. That's the simplest way of structuring an abstract. Unstructured is basically just a paragraph without headers that tells readers the exact same information. It's just not broken down into those headers. The word count, obviously very important, like we saw here in the JDMP. So I want to go back to the author guidelines, less than 200 words, structured abstracts. And here are the headers: background, objective, methods, results, conclusions, and implications for nursing. And for nursing journals, you will typically find that last header, implications for nursing. So what do you think is the most difficult part about this particular kind of abstract? Anyone have a guess? Why is it so important to follow these rules for the manuscript itself, but for the abstract in particular? And what do you think is the most difficult about this particular abstract here? Yeah, the 200 words. That is, it's actually more than some. But trying to summarize your entire project with the background, the objective, the methods, the results, also including implications of nursing or implications for nursing, that's really tight. And so this is where, again, you want to not only read the author guidelines, but take a peek at the most recent issues of the journal in question and just get a feel for what have other authors written in order to meet this, tight word count for the abstract itself. We have a question here about submitting unstructured versus structured. So if you've never submitted an unstructured abstract and you submit a structured one, will they reject it? That's a really good question. I would say it is grounds for rejection. I can't tell you from firsthand experience, but it would show that you didn't read the guidelines. So you want to do everything in your power to follow every guideline, every request or suggestion in the author guidelines so that you're not getting off again on the wrong foot with the editor. It could be that a journal editor is inundated with submissions, and I can tell this as experience of being an editor. If you get 100 submissions for something and you can only pick one, just peeking through and seeing, what, they sent me a structured abstract and I wanted an unstructured one. That would be enough, really, honestly, to say, no, you can't follow directions. I don't want to work with you. Okay, so that would be my answer. Do everything the author guidelines say. If they don't give you instructions, right? So if it just says submit a 200-word abstract and there's no indication of whether it's structured or unstructured, again, that's when I would go to the latest issue or two and just see what have other authors done. Maybe they don't care. And maybe you'll see some that are published with headers and some that are published without. And then you can feel free to submit either way. So that's a good question. What else do we have here? Following the abstract, authors should provide a list of 4 keywords or phrases. Those oftentimes can be mesh terms. I don't know if you've heard of mesh terms, but these would be the medical subject headers. And you can find a lot about this at PubMed. So if you go to NCBI and go to pubmed.gov, you can learn a lot of information about how these databases, these online databases, index your work. Those keywords are crucial for getting your work indexed properly, so that when your colleagues go to PubMed and look for articles related to, say, cardiovascular disease, you will have picked the right keywords for PubMed and other online databases to index your article so that people will find it. Okay. So these are really nice author guidelines, I find, because they're not incredibly detailed. Like, they don't say, okay, you have to submit a 3,500 word article and the introduction can't be more than 500 words and the results can't be more than, 1 double-spaced page. I mean, you can find some really, really difficult to meet author guidelines. And for JD&P, they give you some specifics and just enough to make sure that they're getting consistency. But there's not a dozen pages of rules to follow, so to speak. So down here, like I mentioned in the previous slide, there's copyright information. And that's important. You want to know if you're retaining copyright, if you're giving up copyright, what's entailed in that regard. And then they have a link to their electronic submission. Now, really important, the article types that are accepted. Just going to check the chat for if we have questions. Yes, a link to the mesh terms. Thank you. Thank you so much for adding that. That's great. So if you go to the chat, there is now a link for mesh terms. The article types, quality improvement contributions. These are the bread and butter of D&Ps. This is what I love to help people with, because to me, it's so logical. The structure of the quality improvement manuscript is so logical. There's a problem. You searched and did your literature synthesis to find a solution, and then you implemented that to see if it actually did bring about the types of changes you wanted to bring about at your setting. This is great. So this is the kind of journal that we're looking for if you did a QI. Clinical briefs, now those are typically going to be shorter. You'll see that the word length of the QI documents is about 3,000 words, not including the abstract, tables, figures, and references. That's crucial. 3,000 words is a good length. You typically don't have to, slash and burn with your editing with 3,000 words. Clinical briefs, however, those are typically shorter, 1,500 words. That's about average, I would say. Clinical practice contributions, these are again full length, 3,000 words. And then we have case studies. Those of you that have graduated with your DMP and you're in practice and you're really getting into other ways to publish, case studies are a great way to go. Now we've got 2,500 words. And here you'll find specifics again about how many tables and figures you can have. That is another thing that you don't want to do wrong when you submit. So that's another one where if an editor gets your manuscript and there are 8 tables and they only accept up to 4, they would send it back and say, please follow the guidelines. We only accept 4 tables. Systematic reviews with or without meta-analysis, original research contributions, again, 3,000 words. So it looks like the maximum for all of these larger types of articles is 3,000 words, which is really good. And here it says something really important. And this, I believe, we're going to be covering in November, if I'm not wrong. Danielle, correct me, about querying editors, journal editors. So this paragraph right here, authors may direct general inquiries to the managing editor, and I'm not sure how to say Christine's last name. Could be Coolidge, maybe, or Coolidge. And that would be if you were going to write a query to the editor to see, is my manuscript appropriate for your journal? So that's something that we'll be discussing at a later date in the Pathway to Publication series. So let's take a peek now at the Journal for Healthcare Quality. So we've got, oh, Kulog. Thank you, Dr. Fura says it's Christine Kulog. Kulagi. Okay. The Journal for Healthcare Quality. So we've got, looks like a little bit longer author guidelines with a few more specifics. So I'm just going to point out a few more things to look out for here. So again, it will tell you at the top, the Journal of Healthcare Quality welcomes submissions from all healthcare sectors. Topics of interest include all subjects related to the improvement of healthcare quality. Again, to me, this sounds very appropriate for doctors of nursing practice. And it lists here some specifics about the types of topics, a little bit of history, a little bit of background about the JHQ. We've got the copyright statement here. Each author must complete and submit the journal's copyright transfer agreement. Conflicts of interest. You should know several journals will have a requirement that on your identifying title page, you would then say, are there any conflicts of interest for any of the authors involved? So here's information about that. That's really important as well. It's another one of those things that you might think, oh, you know, that's just a suggestion. No, it's really important. And if you did miss it, it would be grounds for not accepting the publication, not even reading it, just saying, oh, there's no COI statement. We're not going to read that paper. Again, they've got a link to their electronic manuscript submission, and they have some information about first-time users. Sometimes when you have an online manuscript submission software for a journal, you can create an account, and then you can use that same account for submitting future articles, and it just simplifies the process a little bit. Now, here's the bread and butter. This is what we want to be really looking at, the manuscript format. This journal follows the AMA Manual of Style. And believe it or not, it is pretty different from APA. So you will want to either invest in either of those style guides or make sure that you work with an editor who uses either of those style guides. Some editors will specialize in one or the other, and some do both. So that's something to really keep an eye out for, especially when formatting your references and your in-text citations. Okay. Now here we have some more information about original articles. These have a range between 1,500 and again 3,000 words. So that is typically the maximum that you're going to find for your manuscript. Typed, double-spaced, 1-inch margins, 12-point font, and this one accepts both Arial or Times New Roman. Talks about page numbering, beginning with the title page. So it may seem odd to number your title page, although you may be used to that from your DNP program, because typically in scholarly writing, you number the title page as well. Don't want to forget that. Because the review is a blind process, do not include authors' names on manuscript pages or in running heads or footers. Now, if you haven't submitted before, this is something that might feel weird, to take your name off of everything. But it's super important for the peer review process. You want to make sure to get as unbiased of a review as possible. So most of the time you will remove all of the author names, you'll remove all initials. For example, if you had several co-authors and in your methods section, you may have used initials to identify which of the co-authors did specific things within the project methods. But for peer review, you have to remove all of that. In addition to the name of your setting, the name of your location, you would use very general terms in describing your setting. So this is just a reminder that this peer review process needs to be anonymous. You really need to take all identifying information out. This also has some information about authorship. This is very important. And it's something that there's sometimes some drama or debate around it when working with senior authors. Sometimes in a particular department, a senior person in the department will be added at the end of the list of authors, even though that senior person didn't really have anything to do with the paper. So if you're involved in reading this kind of stuff in the literature, you'll see that come up quite a bit. You need to follow the guidelines for who actually qualifies as an author in order to be named as an author on the paper. So this is just a reminder about those rules. Now, again, more specifics here than the last one we looked at. The title should be no longer than 12 to 15 words. That's important information. You might have a really lengthy title. I know some QIs, to really be specific about what you've done, you want to have a lengthy title. So editing that down is going to be a requirement for this journal. And here we have, again, an abstract of 200 words or fewer. But what does it say about the style? Authors should provide a paragraph of 200 words or fewer. It should be a brief, comprehensive summary that addresses the background of the topic, the purpose of the submission, the importance and relevance to healthcare quality. But it doesn't say anything about headers. So this one would not be a structured abstract. This is just a paragraph like we talked about. So you would have the same information that you would have had in the structured abstract, but you would take out the headers. Okay, so little tiny nitpicky things, it seems like, but super important when you don't want your manuscript to be rejected out of hand. Again, with the keywords, this time 3 to 5 keywords. And now we have something else entirely, a biographical sketch. So this says 2 to 3 sentences must be provided for each author and include a summary of the author's credentials, title, affiliation, city and state. So this is something where if you didn't read the author guidelines, you might not think of including that information at all. So going back to one of the initial slides that we had, it's so important. This is why, like, this is your first step to getting published. Just following these rules for the journal that you're interested in is a huge step in the right direction. Now we've got content recommendations. So manuscripts submitted should follow the recommended format under the following headings. So we've got the title, the abstract, the introduction of the paper, the method section, the results. Now this I found very interesting. They want limitations before the discussion. So that's actually backwards from many journals. Again, one indication of why you need to read these guidelines very carefully. And here's what I really wanted to show you from this journal. So this I think is fantastic. The top reasons that manuscripts are sent back for corrections. So if you don't want to get your manuscript sent back to you right after you submit it, do these things. Don't miss out on the biographical sketch for each author. Make sure the title meets the word count limit that we just discussed, 12 to 15 words. Make sure you meet the word count limit for the entire manuscript. I think it was 3,000 was the limit. Make sure that your manuscript is blinded, like we just talked about. Remove the names, remove the initials, remove the name of the setting, and use the primary headings, this list right here. Those 5 reasons, those are the top reasons that manuscripts are sent back, and they're all things that are listed in these author guidelines. So easy to not get your manuscript immediately rejected just by following the guidelines. Okay, so I can't stress this enough how important this is. Now, let's just continue, just kind of scroll through briefly here. They've got a little bit of information about the Irb Approval Statement. That is crucial for every manuscript you submit to every journal. We need to see that. Was it approved or was it deemed exempt? Okay, we just need to see that ethics approval or exemption. Again, details about graphics, what should the artwork be? If you need help with this, definitely hire someone to do it. It can be time consuming. And then the references use AMA style. So there's just details about what that looks like. They've got editorial policies, copyright policy, lots and lots of details, because this is, I think this is pretty consistent for all of the journals that this company produces. And then they have some information about the peer review process. Read that just to be prepared. How long is it going to take between when you submit and when you may actually get published? Now, I will say, based on, again, this little list here, these 5 things for rejection, obviously those aren't the only reasons that a manuscript would need to be corrected. But the best way to shorten the time between when you submit and when you get accepted is by following every single rule in the author guidelines. Because if you do that, you're eliminating a huge amount of potential problems that could send your paper back and forth between peer review and you doing corrections, and then back for review again, and then doing more corrections. So you want to shrink the time between when you first submit and when you actually get accepted for publication. All right, so yes, and Dr. Tayeb says, when in doubt, take a look at the journal's published works. Always, always, always. I would say step 1, read the author guidelines. If anything seems unclear to you, look at the most recent published journals, issues from that journal, and you'll be able to figure out what they need and what they're looking for from you. Now, I just also want to talk a little bit about preparing tables and figures, because that, like I said, it can be daunting. And it is, like, I would recommend, if you don't know someone who's really good with images or creating data tables or figures, because you can't just run a data analysis from like SPSS or SAS or R and submit those tables. Those are not acceptable for publication. They need to be actually following AMA or APA style. So if you're not good with that, or if it's too intimidating or daunting for you, which I totally understand, you'll want to find someone who's used to doing those things and can take your data and make a usable table or figure out of it. I would recommend AMWA, the American Medical Writers Association. So I can put that in the chat. It's amwa.org. And you can search the freelance directory, and you will find people who say that they do that sort of thing. So they will do statistical tables or figures. So I really like that resource. Frequently missed, I want to talk about this. So we mentioned page numbering, and that the title page is typically page 1. But there's also something that usually I would say AMA style journals will want, and that's line numbering. And this is something that is not incredibly intuitive, or at least it wasn't incredibly intuitive in Word. It may be easier to find now. But if you just Google, how do I line number in a Word document? What that does is it puts a little number to the left of every line of text in your manuscript. And that makes it easier for reviewers to say where they want changes. So you might get feedback from a peer review that says, page 2, line 47. And that's where you would then look. But you need to have that line numbering done. And I have had someone who came to me after they had a paper rejected. And that was one of the comments from the peer reviewer, was the lines weren't numbered. And it was in the author guidelines. So that's one of those things that can very easily be avoided. The keywords, like we talked about before, and that Dr. Tayeb posted the link to for the mesh terms. So we want to make sure to get those right. And then the COI, the conflicts of interest. If those are called for and they're missing, that's a problem. So we want to make sure not to miss those. We already went over the top reasons for rejection, all of them easily fixed by reading the author guidelines. And like we just talked about as well, read several recent articles from the most recent or from the journal that you're looking at. And then query the journal article if you, excuse me, query the journal editor if you're not sure if your article is appropriate for that journal. Okay, and sometimes they will discourage queries, but that will typically be explained either on the journal website or on the author guidelines. Right, so questions. I want to know, what did we not cover? Or should we go ahead and look at either of the two example journals? Or have you run across something when you're looking at author guidelines that didn't make sense to you? And we can talk about those things. So anybody have any questions about reading the author guidelines, where to find the author guidelines, or if you've run across something in your search for the right journal and it just didn't make sense? Let's look closer at the JDNP guidelines. Yes, let's do that. So let's start at the beginning. Was there a specific area? Yeah, of course. Dr. Ferrara, would you like to chime in at all on some of these, or if there are extra tips?
Hi. So
Hi.
I'm not going to be on video because I'm not video presentable, but
That's fine.
I mean, I would say, Sara, you really captured it. Follow the guidelines. You know, just from my experience, there's been a lot of submissions over the years where, you know, a recent student graduate would just submit their final project without really paying attention to the guidelines, and it would be way too long. We can't send out manuscripts that are 40 pages. Peer reviewer is not going to read that. You know, I think it's really important to follow the guidelines. And, you know, because this, our journal is one that's really focused on the DNP, you know, we tend to have manuscript submissions that are very specific to, you know, quality improvement. Not a lot of systematic reviews, but quality improvement probably tends to make up the bulk of our submissions. And I think our journal is really well aligned for that because of what theoretically the DNP is supposed to do. So I'm happy to answer any questions. You know, we'll see the QI, we'll see the clinical briefs, and then probably the clinical practice contributions are really those top submission types that we receive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Good. Is there anything that I missed that you would say is really important that needs to be brought up regarding the author guidelines or submissions in general?
And I saw a question in the chat, you know, how do you know which journal is best? Right. So I'm the editor of the Journal of Doctoral Nursing Practice, so that's JDNP. And, you know, you have to look at the mission of the journal. And I think it's always best to look at the last, you know, 2 or 3 issues and see what types of submissions are out there. You know, sometimes if your topic is super focused on, say, diabetes, and I'm talking not just, you know, type 2 diabetes and an intervention, but if you're doing, you know, really intense diabetes work, you know, maybe you want to look to a different journal. But if you're looking at quality improvement, you know, and generalized applicable to nursing practice, well then, you know, JDNP would be a good potential fit. We do get a lot of inquiries from authors. And what I would say to that is we are welcome to answer any inquiries that an author may have. But I think it's also important that people will submit a question like, would you be interested in a manuscript that tackled this issue? And generally speaking, yes, but we really don't have enough information
Yeah.
to go off of like in a paragraph. So what I would say is it's fine to query an editor or managing editor, but if you really think you did your homework and looked at the guidelines and think your manuscript fits, then just submit the manuscript. The downside to that is you can only submit one, that manuscript to one journal at a time. And if, it ends up being rejected, well, then you're free to submit it elsewhere. So that would be the only downside to submitting right away.
Without querying. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And everything you're talking about, I would say those questions are really, really common. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've been updating the My DMP manuscript writing program, and specifically added an introduction video about how to choose a journal, because it seems to be so overwhelming for most, especially first-time authors. I saw that Danielle posted the Jane link to possibly finding a good source for finding the right journal for you. And I always recommend, in addition, asking your network, asking the faculty members that you worked so closely with in your program, and looking at the journals that published the work that you cited in your own manuscript. Because clearly, if you're working in that particular area, in that particular niche, those journals may be looking for the type of article that you have written. And then you'll want to obviously follow the guidelines to edit and format the paper appropriately for those journals. So start with the people that you know and those that are in your niche, and the manuscript that the sources that you used in your own manuscript. And those are usually the best places to start, instead of looking so far afield and just sort of picking at random, because that does take a lot more research to see and read several issues in order to see if those are, if they will publish the kind of work that you have done. So yeah, good stuff. Was there anything else about the JDMP guidelines that anyone had any questions on? Would you like me to scroll further so you can show you those? I don't think the link will be live if I share my screen again. So, oh yeah, thanks. Danielle had posted the link to the Charisse Willis. She's an excellent editor. I've been working with her for several years, and she's a great resource for editing. She and I have been working on the DNP projects, yeah, I would say at least for 6 years together now. So she's at Doc's Editing Shop. And then we've got the My DMP manuscript program. Yes, and the goal is to publish. Absolutely. This is what we want. We want everyone to feel confident in the process. And that's why this is the pathway to publication, right? So what do you need in order to take those steps to get your work published? So were there any other questions that anyone had? I think we covered the questions that are in the chat so far. I'm just scrolling back up, but anyone have any other questions about the process? I did post amwa.org if you're looking for someone specifically to edit or create tables and figures for you. And that's, again, the American Medical Writers Association. It's a little bit of a misnomer because there are a lot of editors in the group. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I think I covered everything that I could think of in regard to this topic. Anytime, feel free to email me. I will put my email in the chat as well. Happy to answer any questions you have about this process, because yes, as Danielle said, like, our goal is to have everyone publish. I can't stress enough how important it is that your work is put out there, that your voices are heard, that all of the work that you're doing is getting recognized, because it is very difficult work. And you may have done a project that you really believe in and just felt intimidated by the whole publication process. That's entirely understandable and doesn't have to be scary. So we're here, everyone that's working on this Pathway to Publication series, we're all here to try to make it a little bit easier and let you know that you're not alone. You don't have to try to interpret all of this stuff yourself. Oh, yes, Dr. Taya brings up a really good point. Don't submit the same manuscript to multiple journals at the same time. Extremely important. Like Dr. Ferrara said, one at a time. So submit only to one journal, and then you'll get feedback whether it's accepted or accepted with changes. And if it's not, then you can submit to another journal, but never two at the same time. Oh, good. And Dr. Ferrara has put his contact information in there as well. Excellent, thank you. Okay, well, if there are no other questions.
Great. I can help close out if there aren't any other questions. Thank you so much, Sara, for sharing your expertise and being committed to the Pathway to Publication series. The series has been the brainchild of Sara and I, and so we're excited that we're going to have 2 more opportunities to talk about ways to get your work published. And as I mentioned in the chat, it's important that we as DMPs of color elevate our work and diversify the literature so that we have more voices that speak to the BIPOC communities that we serve, and so that we can move forward toward eliminating racial and health disparities and forge ahead on our path toward health equity. Thank you again for attending. Before we close, please make sure that you have signed up for our virtual conference that will be coming up on October 23rd. We have a whole host of more events coming up, so please visit our website at www.dnpsofcolor.org and sign up for some upcoming events. This will be recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube page. So be on the lookout for updates to let you all know when it has been, the recording has been uploaded for your consumption. And without any other questions, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your Saturday, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Really, I hope this has been helpful.